When you peel back the pre-Columbian history of the United States, you might just find the Book of Mormon. Hidden in the Heartland. Palmyra, just outside of Rochester in upstate New York, is home to the earliest beginnings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's where the Smith family moved to from Vermont to make a better life. It's also where the heavens were opened, and God himself spoke to a man, namely the prophet Joseph Smith, Jr. Not far away to the south is a hill where an ancient record once lay hidden, until, as instructed by an angelic visitor, the prophet Moroni, it was to be brought forth, translated, and published for all to read as the Book of Mormon. The Hill Cumorah is the one location recognized by the Church where Moroni last buried the gold plates around 421 A.D., the one location that connects modern church history to Book of Mormon history, complete with a large monument of Moroni, celebrating and reminding us of the continuing revelation God gives to his people. In the Church's current Guide to the Scriptures, the Hill Cumorah is described as a small hill located in western New York, where Moroni hid the gold plates, and that Joseph was directed to this hill in 1827. Below this description, the guide lists scriptural references to Cumorah, mainly from the Book of Mormon, where in Mormon chapter 6, verses 2 through 11, about 385 A.D., it reads, "The Nephites gathered at Cumorah, and it was in a land of many waters, and that Mormon, Moroni's father, hid the records in the hill, and finally that all but 24 Nephites were slain." From these references, a casual reader might understandably conclude that this Hill Cumorah would be the final resting place of the Nephites. Interestingly, current-day narrative from scholars in various departments at Brigham Young University who provide much of the information on Book of Mormon geography claims the hill in New York is where Moroni buried the plates, but is not the Hill Cumorah spoken of in Mormon chapter 6. On Main Street in Palmyra is Latter-day Harvest Gift Shop, one of the last independent LDS bookstores that caters to the visitors of Palmyra.
I'm a typical LDS bookstore, so we carry LDS titles, movies, statues, art, and we're right next door to where the Book of Mormon was originally published, just down the street from the Hill Cumorah and the Sacred Grove. So we're within the same space of those sacred sites.
This is actually a pretty common thing in the 1800s when they...
From when I started about 6 years ago, it's completely changed. Little by little, these little independent bookstores have had to really close up shop. I think that what isn't typical of my store is that I have a museum called the Ancient American Museum, and it's filled with artifacts of items that were found here in North America that they give evidence of a culture that lived here called the Hopewell. We get a lot of visitors every year. I believe over 100,000 members of the church visit Palmyra. It's a great visitor center. I think they've done an amazing job, but it's lacking in what is this space, what is this hill. It's more a review of what the Book of Mormon is. I get probably 2 or 3 groups a week that come into the store, they see the museum, and they have questions really about the Hill Cumorah. They come and they visit, and they're not sure, what is it? The majority of the people that I encounter, it's a very confusing idea to them. A lot of times people will tell me, hey, the Book of Mormon happened in Central America, and I'll say, well, where's the hill then? And they'll say, well, it's here. I'll say, well, how does that work? How does that work out within the text of the Book of Mormon if it happened in Central and South America, the hill would have to be there too.
The reason for this thinking is the geographic stretch that would have had to take place between Mesoamerica and upper state New York. In the context of Mormon chapter 6, moving an army of hundreds of thousands all the way to New York, a distance of over 3,000 miles on foot to battle, almost seems an impossibility. For the casual reader of the Book of Mormon, one would think more realistically the idea of Moroni making the journey to the Hill Cumorah as a one-way trip on foot before the end of his life. The only answer given by scholars of the Book of Mormon is a theory called the two-hillcumorah theory.
So the two Cumorahs idea was that we knew in church history that the hill in New York was called Cumorah, and that couldn't be avoided as much as some people would like to. It was still Cumorah, so they said, well, we'll still call that one Cumorah, but there's another Cumorah that's the real Cumorah. And that's the one they figured was in Mexico.
In this video, titled In Search of Ancient Cumorah, it's explained that around 400 AD, the great battles that ended the Nephite nation would have happened at a different Hill Cumorah in Central America. Sometime after the battles subsided, the prophet Moroni would have then unearthed the plates and carried them, along with the Urim and Thummim and the Sword of Laban, on a 3,000-mile journey to the Palmyra area, and there deposited the plates. Besides the distance, the supposed lack of artifacts or physical evidence of an ancient culture in New York are the reasons cited in the video why the North American hill isn't Cumorah. The Church has remained neutral in any position having to do with the geography of the Book of Mormon. Even though the video is 20 years old, the theory is still supported to this day, and yet there is no recorded reference from Joseph Smith as to a second hill. So where did this theory come from?
Well, you know, it's interesting because in the 1879 Book of Mormon that Orson Pratt divided into chapters, he had a footnote in there that said the Hill Cumorah is in New York. And that edition was published until, as I recall, about 1921. And in 1921, Elder Talmage was on a committee to review the scriptures, and they removed all the geography footnotes. And what that did was kind of open the door to alternative ideas, because as long as the footnote in the Book of Mormon said the Hill Cumorah is in New York, that was settled, right? But once they took that footnote out, it allowed people to develop alternative ideas. Well, at the same time, there was this, I think his name was Lewis Hills, who was a scholar from the Reorganized Church. And he had been doing a study of the Book of Mormon in some depth. And so he had concluded that the descriptions in the Book of Mormon describe a fairly small area that would not encompass the entire continent. And as a result of just the process of elimination, he figured that Cumorah couldn't have been in New York, it was just too far away. So as I recall, he was the first one to really give some kind of a conceptual justification for a two Cumorah theory.
One of the early Latter-day Saint references made to a second hill came from a book written in 1947 called Cumorah Where, written by Thomas Stewart Ferguson. Ferguson was a lawyer and an early proponent of the Mesoamerican model, who helped start the New World Archaeological Foundation at BYU, used to research pre-Columbian cultures in Mesoamerica. Ferguson made the case that the hill needed to be closer to the Book of Mormon lands of Mesoamerica, thus needing to move the long-believed location of the Hill Cumorah southward. The final chapter defends this thinking by stating, "The mere fact that the early members of the Church took up the New York view, and that it has been adhered to ever since, does not necessarily make it correct."
There were a few general authorities that didn't like it. And and I can see why, you know, but you know, President Benson did say he was in favor of, in support of anybody in anything promoting the Book of Mormon. So he did a lot of great missionary work with it. He gave over 300 slide lectures on the Book of Mormon. Even though he was in the wrong place, he was talking about the right book.
As a convert to the church, I purchased a book by the guy by the name of Palmer. I did get it, I did read it, and I thought, well, golly, two Hill Cumorah, I guess that's okay. You know, big war down there. They walk up here. Joseph finds the book, you know, in the 1820s. Wonderful. I didn't even question it.
The one that was really seminal on the Two Cumorahs theory was In Search of Cumorah. And so I read that book. I bought it when it first came out. I have a first edition because I was into this all the way back then when I was at BYU. And so I read that book and I was convinced, you know, because the reason I was convinced is I didn't know the other side.
From the earliest days of the two-hill-cumorah theory, its validity was called into question. One of its doubters was Joseph Fielding Smith. In Doctrines of Salvation, referring to the two-hill-cumorah theory, he states, "Because of this theory, some members of the church have become confused and greatly disturbed in their faith in the Book of Mormon. It is for this reason that evidence is here presented to show that it is not only possible that these places could be located as the church has held during the past century, but that in very deed such is the case." The chapter then proceeds to give account after account of quotes and history focused on the Hill Cumorah.
It was sometime in the 1930s when Joseph Fielding Smith was the church historian, and he heard about this Two Cumorahs idea. And he's the one that denounced it. He said it was going to cause people to lose their faith and so forth. So he came out pretty strongly against it. But he published his analysis, or his thing about the Two Hills theory, back in the 30s. And then 20 years later, in 1956, I think it was Bruce R. McConkie actually who compiled his previous sermons and writings into Doctrines of Salvation. So that's how it appeared there.
In his 1957 book, Just One Cumorah, Riley L. Dixon comments on an alteration of the two-hill-cumorah theory. He states, "A word of caution is necessary to this generation. Some students have taken upon themselves the privilege of making private interpretations of the Book of Mormon scriptures and have caused a slight division among its readers." Dixon refers to the idea that not only is the hill in New York not the original Cumorah where the battles happened, but is also not the hill where the plates were buried, but that the plates were moved somehow for the convenience of the prophet Joseph. In either case, Dixon writes, "None of the prophets of God, nor any of the members of the Council of the 12 suggested such hypothesis." Wayne May recalls his change of heart after reading the book The Personal Writings of Joseph Smith.
Because I had been a student of Midwest archaeology, things were running parallel, but at some point, I didn't realize this, they were going to cross. And when they cross, it was going to be a crash. And that happened in 1989 when I got a hold of Dean C. Jesse's book, which what was published in there was Joseph's incredible letter on the march from Ohio to Illinois, when he writes to Emma, "We've just walked across the plains of the Nephites, picking up their bones and skulls as proof of its divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon." And I just said, man, something is really wrong here. So as I began to look at that, I got to tell you, support for Central America fell away very rapidly.
Author Jonathan Neville gives a description of his book, Letter 7.
Well, Oliver Cowdery's letter 7 was the 7th of 8 letters that he and Joseph wrote together. In fact, right at the beginning, Oliver said, Brother Joseph helped us write this letter because he was the only one who had some of the knowledge. And so the 7th letter, letter 7, talks about specifically the Hill Cumorah, identifies where it is. It's on the mail road between Palmyra and Canandaigua, and it's on the east side of the road, and it's the largest hill. So he gave this description. And then he said it was on about a mile to the east, or to the west from the Hill Cumorah. There's another ridge that's parallel. It was between those two, about a mile-wide valley, where the final battles of the Nephites took place.
And what's really funny, when Jonathan Neville comes out many years later with Letter 7, I already had Letter 7 in my hands. And I published it in 2001 in my first book. But when I received it, it was given to me, and it said, author unknown. I still have it. But I did put it in my book. So, I mean, it is there. So know that I did have it. It's in my book. But I didn't beat the drum on it because I didn't have a reference.
Another pushback of the two-hill Cumorah theory came from one known as the Fighting Preacher. Willard Bean was the first Mormon to settle in Palmyra 85 years after the expulsion of Joseph Smith and his followers in the 1830s. In 1915 Palmyra, persecution against the saints was still physical. It took a boxer who could hold his own to be called to serve there. His mission, while living in and cultivating the old Smith family farm, was to purchase the Hill Cumorah, as well as other church sites, for church preservation. His 5-year mission turned to almost 25 years, and in that time Bean spent many days on that sacred site. In 1948, Bean, along with Cecil McGavin, printed a publication called Book of Mormon Geography, in search of Rama Cumorah. In it, Bean refers to the exclusions of geographical references from earlier editions of the Book of Mormon as a result of the popularity of this new theory. This book refers to itself as a plea in defense of the old theory, the interpretation of Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, Orson Pratt, and a countless number of the authorities of the church. The publication then gives example after example of evidence of an ancient culture that once resided in North America. So even with these calls for correction about the Hill Cumorah, the Mesoamerican model of the Book of Mormon continued to be the standard that members of the church adapted to.
The first time they illustrated the Book of Mormon was for the World's Fair in 1960. And they put in all these photos from Central and South America. They had all the Arnold Freeberg paintings in there, which was interesting because Arnold Freeberg painted Cumorah in New York specifically. He put an oak tree in there with a leaf on it, so everybody knew that was in New York, where everything else was in Central America.
But is there really no evidence of an ancient people in the New York area before Columbus?
It's really an alien thing when people come from out west and say, oh no, the Book of Mormon happened somewhere else. We're surrounded by evidence of the Book of Mormon. We're surrounded by the forts that are spoken of in the Book of Mormon. The historic societies here have the artifacts. The universities here have the artifacts. University of Buffalo, over 1 million artifacts. The newspapers, the newspaper that was printed right next door has article upon article upon article of what was found in this area early on. So it's really an alien idea to those that live here that Book of Mormon land is somewhere else.
The real question is, are there any sites out there that have not yet been excavated, or is it still possible to pick up implements? I can give you an example. I was with an archaeologist from the University of Buffalo, and he's identified about 30 Hopewell sites in western New York that he knows had Hopewell artifacts. We went to one of them, and we were walking around, he was showing us stuff, and he just picked up a few little artifacts that were like old arrowhead things, and he said, here, you can take this, they're all over here. But the stuff is so abundant. He has over 1 million artifacts in his archive that haven't even been cataloged. So to say that there's no artifacts is just either intentional or, misinformed ignorance.
We had this thing from Dr. Talmage, who was a geologist by profession, and when he was a student out there, he went around the Hill Cumorah as much as 2 to 3 miles out, and he took samples, soil samples, all the way back to the hill. But he tells this, and he's recorded in a book by Riley Dixon, and he tells about finding just below the surface, 8 or 10 inches down, this layer of white dust. And he gets it checked out, and it's calcium phosphate. Basically, it's human bone that's been decayed.
Writing one of the first publications for the Smithsonian Institute in 1848, known as Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, Ephraim Squire documented the mountain of evidence of a culture later to be known as the Hopewell. There was so much evidence that he wrote a second publication a year later, specifically for New York alone. Squire in turn acknowledged much of his findings from New York Governor DeWitt Clinton. Clinton gained a love for learning about the early inhabitants of New York, spending much of his time in expansion and development. Speaking to the Historical Society in 1808, Clinton said, "Previous to the occupancy of this region by the progenitors of the present race of Indians, it was inhabited by a race of men much more populous and much more advanced in civilization. Who they were, whence they came, and whither they went have been themes of speculation with learned antiquarians who have failed to arrive at any satisfactory conclusions. At a later meeting with the Historical Society, Clinton continued, "Why have we no history of such a nation as must have inhabited this part of the world? Probably if a knowledge of these ancient people is ever obtained, it will be derived from inscription on stone or metals, which have withstood the rust of time."
Then they also say that if there was hundreds of thousands of people killed there 2,000 years ago, the place should be full of artifacts. Early LDS people who went out to Cumorah to visit in the late 1800s and the early 1900s said that local farmers had barrels of arrowheads that they had picked up, when they were farming, plowing their fields, that people would just come and take as souvenirs. And it's like over in Israel, they have the Valley of Elah where David and Goliath were, and all the Israeli farmers, whenever they plow up the rocks, they all take them there because the tourists take them home. So Israel has exported tons of rocks as souvenirs, David and Goliath. Same thing happened in Palmyra. So at some point, any archaeological site that's picked over for 100 years is going to be empty.
Taking an example from the Civil War, the largest battle took place in what is now Antietam National Battlefield in Sharpsburg, Maryland. The Battle of Antietam happened on September 17, 1862. Known as the bloodiest day in United States history, it had a combined tally of over 22,000 dead, wounded, or missing. While some of the artifacts of that battle, such as cannons, bullets, and guns, are maintained through modern techniques of preservation, most of the devastation of that bloody day long ago has been picked over and replanted with farms and reconstruction. While little artifacts remain from a war that happened 160 years ago, how much would one expect to find from events that happened 1,600 years ago? So the question remains, have we truly closed the door on the site in New York known as the Hill Cumorah?
My feelings is that it's a place where battles happened. It's a place where a depository was. That the hill is what the brethren have said it is. What Joseph said it was and what Oliver said it was, and that's my personal feeling. 1991,
I started calling Dr. Sorensen at BYU, and I wanted to ask them to bring a guy to the Midwest. Let me show him what's out here. That's all I want to do. And at this two-hillcumorah thing, it was really, it was really bugging me. As I continued to look at this and say, my gosh, why can't we discuss North America? Don't you go to college? Isn't a college supposed to be open? And you look at idea A and idea B and idea C without having a feud or a fight or people getting upset with you, but they have a set thing, just like blinders on a horse, and you bring up something new and oftentimes you'll get ridiculed. And I was concerned because I had so much problem with trying to approach the anthropology department at the Y, trying to get somebody to come out and visit. And I just got totally shut down. They didn't want to give me time of day.
Everything that's being found in Central America points to a different group of people. Yes, a group of people that had interaction with the Savior Jesus Christ, but not the Nephite people, not the Jaredite people. So just a different culture, but not who the Book of Mormon is speaking of.